morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session on African geopolitics in transformation, what future for peacebuilding. My name is Giovanni Faleg, and I'm the senior analyst responsible for the Africa portfolio at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, the agency of the EU analyzing foreign security and defense policy issues. Let me start this session by thanking each and every one who is virtually present here today, and also express my gratitude to the organizers of the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development, particularly SIPRI and the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Many of us are familiar with the relocation and moving services, and I can certify that the efforts made by the organizing team to relocate the entire forum online have been paramount, and certainly no less than moving the event physically to another country. On behalf of the EU ISS, we gladly accepted to lead this virtual session, and we are therefore grateful for the opportunity and the excellent technical support we received to do so from the organizers. The objective of this session is to understand how the geopolitical dynamics at play in Africa, entailing profound changes in the economic, commercial, political, and security relations, can bear implications for peacebuilding policies and approaches in the next decade, altering the way peace can be built, maintained, protected, or restored. This is even more important to discuss today as exogenous shocks, the COVID-19 pandemic, is likely to accelerate pre-existing trends, exacerbate drivers of fragility, and alter the pathways towards peaceful transitions in the continent. In the next hour, we will discuss these issues with an impressive lineup of speakers. And for this, I'm truly honored to be the moderator of this debate. The session will be structured as follows. Right after my introduction, I will give the floor to Irina Nyoni, Deputy Director General and Head of the Africa Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, for her keynote opening remarks. Then, I will open an expert roundtable debate with four leading think tankers: Jakkie Cilliers, Chairman of the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria; Judd Devermont, Director of the Africa Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies; Mesfin Gebremichael, Assistant Professor at the Institute of Peace and Security Studies of the University of Addis Ababa; and AMANDINE Nyoni, researcher affiliated to the European Center on Foreign Relations. This roundtable will be immediately followed by high-level policy perspectives provided by Dr. Gebremichael, Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, and by KOEN VERVAEKE, Managing Director for Africa from the European External Action Service of the European Union. There will be time for a short Q&A afterwards. You will be able to ask written questions using the Ask the Moderator function that you have on the software. Please submit your questions at any time during the webinar, indicating whether they are addressed to one or more panelists and including your name and affiliation. I will then select during the Q&A 2 or 3 questions and read them out loud so that our speakers can answer. If your question is not selected, I apologize in advance, but time constraints do not allow us to have a longer time for debate. So thank you in advance for your attention and participation. And without further ado, I would like now to give the floor to Irina for her opening remarks.
I hope you can see and hear me. We had a good testing round before, so I hope this works. I would like to start by thanking the organizers, of course, and thanks for inviting me to this interesting debate. I was studying the theme. It's quite broad. You can put a lot into it, and I'm not going to try to do all of that, of course, but just share with you a few thoughts from the Swedish perspective. I think I had sort of focused on peace building and geopolitics in those two headings. And I think that it doesn't come as a surprise to any of you that the focus on peace building from the Swedish approach is obviously very much also the Nordic approach, and very much so the EU, is really to look at how can you achieve a participatory process, meaning women, peace and security, youth, peace and security. How can we make sure that those lead to sustainable peace? Well, we know rule of law, human rights, transparency, local democracy, all of these issues. So then the question, I guess, becomes how does building these crucial ingredients and these building blocks, how does that relate to the geopolitical interests and influence and debate, and how that debate is run by those? It is now a while ago since Sweden were in the Security Council. I was lucky to be one of the colleagues working in New York at the time. I would say that probably that experience is very much still relevant today. The situation seems to be more or less the same. So I dare say that we still have a situation that in the council where the real discussions around what creates peace building is not really as present as one would like, but rather the dynamics is so much more moved into open confrontation between the permanent members. I think we all know mostly between Russia, US, and China. What is interesting, of course, in this is that when the African countries, the A3, when they are united, it has shown to be quite a cost politically and possibly also economically to go against them. And there is still an interest, I think, to safeguard those good relations with the African countries. We can still see, though, of course, that the ability to split them is still considerable. And of course, national interest remains priority number one for African countries, just as it does for all members of the Security Council. We do have to navigate both national, regional, and global interests, and they are not always complementary, of course. I think that we have seen, though, that this unity is possible, and I think we experienced when we were in the Council that as EU members, when we managed to come together, we had joint open press statements or other type of joint statements, it proved to be quite forceful. We were at our last year also 5 EU member states on the Council at the same time. But we have also seen that when the African countries do join together, the A3, they also have joint meetings, joint press statements. And of course, when you have an agreement in the African Union PSC that gives it more push, just as it did for us when we had council conclusions from Brussels to lean on. So in this peace building debate, we do still see that issues like women, peace and security, and the youth, peace and security, the children on conflict, climate and security, these issues still have a pretty good chance to be successful. They're not controversial in the same way, and they could be sort of reasonably easy gives to, for example, the A3. So they can serve as pretty useful issues to show that unity and illustrate that. That might be quite an important push to counter this geopolitical moves that we see. I think we also, of course, all see now that the Africans, of course, can also benefit from this increased interest in their markets, which is, of course, one of the reasons why this sort of new geopolitical situation is playing out in Africa. And the question I think that would be interesting for us to discuss here or also going ahead is really how we can find a way of identifying and defining how we can have mutual benefits on building sustainable societies. So rather than sacrificing some or all of the issues around social, economic, environmental sustainability in the struggle for influence and market shares and power, how can we rather find a way of seeing how can a sustainable Africa become a common interest and a goal for not, of course, only the Africans, but also all the other powers? And are there a clear enough priorities for the African Union and its member states so that the individual member states can choose that rather than choosing a national government interest or being in good relation with one or several of the other superpowers that might not have exactly those interests at hand. So African solutions to African problems, that's what we normally say. Maybe in peace building and sustainability can translate into local solutions to local problems. And then I think we are back again to rule of law, transparency, inclusiveness, and local democracy. So there we are back again to the AU and the AU unity and how they can support these processes in the individual countries. So to conclude, I think strengthened collaboration and partnership with the African Union is probably the way to go. And it's definitely a policy that Sweden is working very hard on continuously. I thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Irina, and inspired by your remarks. We now open the expert roundtable to go deeper into the theme of the session. I will start with Jakkie Cilliers from ISS Pretoria, who recently published a book on Africa's future titled Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution. And would like then to kick off the discussion by asking Jakkie, what are the main trends that are shaping Africa's future? What does strategic foresight tell us about peace and conflict in the continent in the next decade? The floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. So Africa has suffered from 4 recent shocks in the recent years. The first, of course, was the Arab Spring, started in December of 2010, that destabilized the whole of North Africa. The second was the end of the commodity supercycle as the Chinese economy in particular rebalanced. The third is the fact that the world is in a slow growth era because of changing demographics. The rest of the world in particular, we see declining size of the working age population except in Africa. And then of course now we are experiencing COVID-19, which is a huge shock to Africa and the global system. So if things develop as the IMF expect them to develop, Africa and the world will enter a deep V-shaped contraction where growth in Africa will contract to minus 3% per annum. It would have been almost a plus 2.6%. And in our estimation, and we're just doing a study on this, we will in 2020 probably see about 162,000 additional deaths, both from COVID as well as the economic impact. But over time, the economic impact of COVID will see significantly more mortality in Africa than as a result of COVID. And Africa's GDP will shrink. Our estimate is by about $170 billion this year. And in this year alone, about 15 million additional Africans will fall into extreme poverty. So this is not a good news story in the short term. The longer term trajectory is that things are improving in Africa, but they are improving more slowly than in the rest of the world. And I wrote an entire book that Giovanni mentioned about this. So to illustrate this, I mean, Africa is at the moment about 3% of the world economy. And we expect, if we look out to 2040, that by 2040, Africa's slice of the global economy would have increased from 3% to 4%. Yet our population changes from having 17% of the world's population at the moment to about 23%. So there's a huge imbalance. And we also, on the current trajectory, expect that Africa will not meet the goal of eliminating extreme poverty by 2030. In actual fact, our forecasts, what we refer to as our current path forecast, is that about 500 million Africans will remain in extreme poverty by 2030. So this is very concerning. These things can only change if Africa more rapidly goes through its demographic transition and get to its demographic dividend much earlier. If, secondly, it implements the African Continental Free Trade Area. According to the Continental Free Trade Area, by 2034, Africa will eliminate about 97% of tariffs. And that, having a larger market, has all kinds of spin-offs and benefits. And if Africa can use digitization and the fourth industrial revolution to leapfrog, a leapfrog. Coming from a very low base, Africa has considerable potential if it can go up the manufacturing escalator and industrialize. And Africa also needs to invest in basic infrastructure such as water and sanitation. But none of this is possible unless we see the momentum that is evident in Africa of improved governance continue, that we have elites that govern our 55 countries that are really pro-growth and not stuck in the past, as many of them are. So Giovanni, you specifically asked about peace and security. And I think the fundamental point is just to make the point that if you draw a map of where the world is unstable, the world is unstable where the world is poor. There's a one-to-one mapping. So the broad trend is that Africa is becoming more stable, largely because as countries become wealthier, governments get more capacity and they can provide greater stability. And with the exception of terrorism in certain regions of Africa, armed violence in Africa is declining. But while that is happening, protests, particularly in urban areas, is increasing. This is largely a function of rapid democratization and as people struggle for greater accountability. So you see a kind of a X-shaped. On the one side, armed violence is slowly coming down, urban protest is slowly increasing. The reality is that Africa will remain unstable, but that's inevitable because instability and development go hand in hand. But instability will, I think, continue to decline. Whereas in much of the rest of the world, we see a process of democratic backsliding, amongst others in Europe and North America. I don't see that in Africa. In spite of the influence and the enormous role that China plays in Africa, I think that what we will see is that democratization will continue in Africa. Africans have had enough of authoritarian leadership and they've experienced decades of military rule. Most important is that for Africans to trade with one another, and that's why I made the emphasis on the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And eventually, I think what is true is that whereas in the past we often looked to Europe to develop us, and now we're looking to China to develop us, only Africans will develop Africa, but we need the help of the international community. And that it is hugely important that Africa not become a victim of this global struggle for power between China and the United States.
Thank you, Jakkie. I have to interrupt just because we need to give the floor to other speakers, but there will be time also to get back to these points during the Q&A. Let me now turn to Judd Devermont and talk about the exogenous shock that you mentioned, Jakkie, COVID-19, especially as CSIS has worked a lot on these items. So my question will be to you, Judd, how much COVID stands in the way to unleash Africa's potential, also with regards to peace building and conflict trends? Is there a direct or indirect relationship? The floor is yours, Judd.
Great, thank you. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. Yes, COVID-19 is a major shock, and it really has unsettled the security landscape in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll talk just briefly about the near-term impacts, and then maybe we can all think together about some of the mid and long-term implications, which may not be as negative. But certainly when you look at how COVID-19 has changed the security landscape just in the near term, we are seeing an increase in extremist violence. According to the Armed Conflict Events Location Database, ACLID, they're saying there's a 28.5% increase in attacks just between mid-March to early May. And so while in other parts of the world, extremists are practicing social distancing and focus on self-care, that's not happening in our region, in the region that we're talking about today. Groups like Al-Sunna, the ISIS-linked group in Mozambique, is actually expanding in its attacks, showing greater sophistication. Al-Shabaab just yesterday killed a governor in Puntland. JNIM, the Al-Qaeda network in the Sahel, has kidnapped the leading opposition leader in Mali, Somalia Cisse. He's been now held for at least a month. And then we are seeing Boko Haram really move out in attacks, executing the most deadly attack in Chad's history, or at least under the rule of Idris Deby. And we're also seeing them find new narratives, propaganda narratives during this time. Boubacar Shekau of the Boko Haram faction says, you have coronavirus, we are the antivirus. And we're seeing Shabab and others do that as well. And so while we have the extremists moving out, the countervailing forces, the regional governments, the international partners, well, many of them are sheltering in place. They're distracted because they're enforcing their own COVID-19 restrictions, and some of them are being afflicted by the disease. So I won't call it an open door, but the extremists have had an opportunity to move out during this period. And just briefly, of course, in countries like Kenya and South Africa and Nigeria, the security forces are being used to help ensure that the lockdown takes place. We are seeing already places like Amisom where some of the troops have COVID-19, according to the East African. 30 Ugandan troops of Amisom and 7 Burundi troops have COVID-19. The UN has paused rotations in the region. The Irish took the opportunity to pull out their forces of MINUSMA. And then with Barkhane, the French operation, at least 4 of their fighters have been tested positive for COVID-19, and the US base in Djibouti declared a state of emergency largely as a precautionary measure so they could pull some of their contractors back onto the base. But it gives you a flavor that right now the forces are not even in terms of the way they had been operating prior to the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, what this means over the long term, or at least the medium term, is really interesting. First, I think there is a threat that some of the gains that had been made in various counterinsurgency, counterterrorism theaters may be lost. But I also think that there's some potentially positive developments. And Jakkie and I talked about some of these on my podcast, Into Africa. But in some cases, we are seeing governments talk more about accountability for security forces abuses. Both President Ramaphosa of South Africa, Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya, and President Masisi of Botswana. The South African forces just recently are starting to build hospitals, which I think is an interesting use of your military to address civil relations. The AU, while this has been in the help lane, has been actually very vocal about governments that are not doing what they should be with response to the COVID-19 outbreak, whether they're talking about Burundi, or at least they're being very, very measured about how they think about different approaches, and they need to be based by science. And so we'll see if some of those strengths from the AU transition into conflict and mediation. And then finally, I'm an optimist that maybe some of the things that we're doing for COVID-19 in terms of contact tracing, better communication, can be dual purpose and can be translated to how we think about counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and conflict mediation. So again, I think we're kind of thinking as we watch events unfold, but there's a lot that perhaps can be positive about this, but of course, the immediate term is very negative. And I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Judd, and there will be an opportunity also to come back to that during the Q&A. I will now turn to Mesfin from IPSS. Mesfin, your region, the Horn of Africa, has become a geopolitical crossroads. So from your point of view, how is growing global power, competition, and influence impacting on security trends? And has the African Agency changed as a result? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for inviting me to this interesting session. Let me mention some pointers directly related to the questions that we have raised. Since the end of the Cold War, and mainly after the 9/11 terror attack of the Twin Towers in New York, the focus of the global powers in this sub-region has been like on fighting international terrorism and piracy and so forth. But what we have seen over the last 10 years and mainly over the last 5-6 years is the geo-economics dominance of China in this sub-region. And as a result of this, I can say that the Chinese have dominated all the trade activities and infrastructural developments and so forth in this sub-region, mainly in the Horn. I'm talking about the Horn of Africa region. Like even when we go far from the Horn of Africa, we can see, like for example, the trade volume of the Chinese has reached more than 200 billion USD annually, while the trade volume of USA is about 5 million USD, and in fact it's declining. And additionally to this, the Chinese have also invested a lot on the infrastructural developments, including roads, railroads, ports, and so forth. But in relation to this, what we see is, as a new phenomenon in many of the African countries, is a debt crisis. So I can say a debt crisis is one of the new developments associated with the global powers' involvement in this region. As a result of the geoeconomics domination of China, this has led that into moving opposite direction. I mean, moving USA into opposite direction. We can see that the economics policies adopted by the Trump administration since 2018. So this is one of the major new developments in this region, recent new developments. The second one is related with securitization of ports. This is also a result of the heavy involvement of the Gulf countries in port development, and also the Chinese. And this has led, in fact, in securitization of the ports. And I can say now, the ports around in many Horn of Africa have become like a garrison ports. Of course, this is not considered only in negative aspect. It involves also some benefits to the countries in the Horn of Africa. But I don't think that the securitization of the ports brings more of positive advantages to the countries in the Horn. The third major important development is related with the domestic factors in the countries of the Horn of Africa. This is mainly related with now what we see in many countries, some countries in the Horn of Africa is political transition, but associated with instability. We can see this kind of transition like in Sudan, Ethiopia, and the other countries like South Sudan and so forth are not also of involve in situations. So the relationship of these three factors has influenced or brought some consequences to the peace and security of the countries in this region. Like, for example, diplomatic relationships have become more of transactional and bilateral, and multinational organizations have become less relevant. There is an injection of cashes that has forced countries to ally with one or the other, and the involvement of the global powers in the water diplomacy.
Mesfin, thanks a lot for your points. I will have to interrupt you now because time is running up. If you have just one concluding statement, feel free to go ahead, but I will have to, otherwise it will be best if I move on to the next speaker. And again, I might give you 2 minutes at the end to just conclude your points, if that's okay with you. So let me now turn to the next speaker, who is AMANDINE Nyonguenon. AMANDINE, you are an expert of conflict prevention, and you will soon publish a policy brief with the UASS on early warning systems in West Africa. My question here is clear-cut. I mean, we have several challenges. What is the place for prevention in this world and against these transformations? The floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Giovanni. Thank you for the invitation. As you know, conflict prevention is very large, so we can talk about conciliation, mediation, and as you mentioned, I will answer your question by speaking about early warning system in Africa. They are defined as tools to provide with timely information, analysis, and response options. What is particularly interesting with the early warning system is because they are a very interesting example of the most important challenges at the moment for effective conflict prevention policy is to transform early warning into early action. And this gap is not new, and Jakkie should probably say something about this. But the question is why this gap is still persistent. And of course, it depends on the region, in West, in Central, in Eastern Africa. It's not the same situation, but I would say there are plenty of operational, logistical, political, and also institutional explanation. Their explanation are mainly due to the fact that early warning and early action are different, distinctive culture, function, dynamics, and they are involving several stakeholders. I would like to draw the attention on probably one more important question, the political one. And I would say that despite of the institutionalization and professionalization of the early warning system, showing interest from the member states, African member states, to use conflict prevention tool, national interest and also sovereignty take over when discussing the prevention agenda. And it's not specific to Africa. In every situation, conflict qualification is a very sensitive issue. So early warnings sometimes become more political than technical, and it almost reflects for political decision makers to question the methodology and assumptions upon which the analysis are based and also the recommendations are made. And sometimes we could say that they consider it political meddling. So to bring answer on your question about institutional mechanism, how can we address these challenges? Taking the example of ECO1, the ECOWAS early warning system, but also the CUES, the Continental Early Warning System of the African Union, I could say that they are working on two main components. The first one is to build trust by improving understanding of early warning system methodology and objective, especially in a context where now we have a confusion between open data collection and intelligence. And beyond increasing technical process, decision makers, especially member states, are concerned about respect of confidentiality. Second, commit stakeholders are working to refine the tool, especially concretely by making sure that they provide upstream specified and clear requirements and then detailed feedbacks on their outputs. This is the best way to improve the quality of analysis and meet final user expectations. These two dimensions are essential prerequisite to fill the gap and address challenges. I would like also to mention one major obstacle to effective early action. Many threats to peace are regional in nature and need to be addressed in a coordinated way, locally, nationally, regionally. Early warning systems need to be adapted to develop capacity to anticipate rapidly changing nature of conflicts and their transregional dynamics. We have a good example with the Sahel and the Lac Czech Basin. The current sanitary crisis is also a good opportunity to consider instability beyond the hard security prism with a multidimensional perspective, taking into account its impacts on economic, social, and political pre-existing vulnerabilities. At the crossroad of this selection of challenges, early warning systems need to be supported by local actors. First, not to miss out local information, and then to use them as local peace actor for the mediation in low-intensity conflicts. The last thing I would like to say, it's the only way to make sure that we have an efficient and effective prevention in the coming decades is to move from the status quo, defended now by the more conservative countries, to a situation where the culture of conflict prevention is promoted by a majority of reformist actors, pushing for a more open dialogue about states' structural vulnerabilities and risk of conflict eruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Amandine. This is perfect. And as you now have seen, our expert roundtable mostly focused on trends that will shape Africa's future, COVID-19 as an exogenous shock, global powers' influence, and also developing a culture of prevention. Let us now then have the policy perspective and the high-level one. And for that, I would like to first give the floor to Dr. Worknek Gebremichael, who is the Executive Secretary of IGAD. The floor is yours, Dr. Gebremichael, for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will be very short as much as possible. Thank you for the organizers. The geopolitical aspect of this, the Horn has already touched by experts very well, so I'm not going to go to that area. I fully concur most of the issues addressed by the previous speakers. In fact, I want to emphasize on the areas of new development in the region, that is, which Professor Mesfin has tried to raise. In each country in the Horn of Africa, the things which has happened, which really relocate their geopolitical reading in one way or another way. So there are some issues that I listed here that will really influence positively in one way or another. The geopolitical coalition or confrontation or coordination will continue in this region, since this region is a region which is very near to the Red Sea, which is very important for trade and all issues that you know. Based upon that, the COVID issue has completely changed some of the geopolitical points and will change for the future that or influence the way of life in the region. The first one is the health itself, that is COVID. COVID is directly attacking not only the human, the economy, the farmers, the productivity, the GOP, and also the use as well as the productivity of the regions. That will have direct impact on food insecurity. That is an acute problem that already we have. The food insecurity, which will be added already another 2 COVIDs, which are locust and flooding, which is creating a lot of damage. Flood has taken more than 280 people. That is more than COVID has done to this region. The locust issue is, this is the first in the history of this region after 25 years, which is damaging the harvest of the farmers, which really make vulnerable more than 25, even 30 million people of the region. These 2 things will create the problem in peace and security areas. That is very visible. Already these confinement issues are a problem in the region. In most of the cities in the region, for example, you can take in Nairobi, Kibera, or in Ethiopia, Mercato, the people are living in slums, which is very difficult to make this kind of social distancing as well, and difficult to live 2-3 days in the home. That's also another very critical issue. These areas is already started in some place, displacement and migration. So these all things finally going to bring the displacement and migration issues, which will be a real challenge, not only for the region, but also international problems that already we have it. This region have a pack of a lot of problems, but as well opportunities. But the COVID issue really will affect the geopolitics of the region, this region. Of course, the competition between China and America, which Professor Mesfin was saying, it will continue. We are saying, we are looking very visibly that will positively or negatively affect. The areas of focus on peace building in our region will continue to be the South Sudan issue, the Somalia issue, the water wars and maritime conflicts, counter-radicalization, migration management, and communal electoral violences. These are the issues that will continue with us to deal with it. So to conclude, the scenarios that I'm seeing for the next years is escalation in conflict and transitional security threats. That is number 1. Expect higher level of migration. That is because of the effects that I have mentioned earlier. The IGAD region will continue to be a trade theater of international interest. That is very clear that all the speakers were saying. Some interstate and intra-regional conflicts will be closer to resolution. Otherwise, some of them may escalate. That is the other thing. And also because of this COVID and the interest of convergence, stronger IGAD peace and security architecture to revitalize IGAD treaty and institutional capacity. Maybe we can take it an opportunity because the IGAD heads of states and government are making continuous consultation, even if they have their own internal issues, and some of them have conflicts as well. So COVID-19 will strengthen global cooperation in the region as well. That is what we think. And also, even if it is virtual or after it's opened, multilateralism will be strengthened because we cannot live, our border is very porous. So the coordination thing is going to be very close, very important one. These are the issues that I want to bring to your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Workneh, for this excellent presentation, and also for sharing the slides with us. I will now turn to KOEN VERVAEKE from the European External Action Service. The EU has been mentioned on a couple of occasions, so we will be very interested to hear the perception from Brussels. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, and good afternoon, everyone. A lot of issues have been raised, so I will just pick some of them for my contribution. As you know, 2020 was Africa year for the European Union. We are heading for a summit at the end of the year, and it's a year where we wanted to strengthen our partnership and bring it at a higher level. And of course, what is happening now with COVID-19 changes profoundly the context in which we are doing this. And I think we have to take a few minutes, few moments to consider what is at stake here. It's clear that COVID-19 is changing profoundly the way we look at globalization, and maybe the nature of globalization will be.
KOEN, sorry to interrupt. It seems that you might have your hand in front of the mic because we can hear you, but not fully well. So probably if you can try and speak now to see if it has improved. Thank you.
Okay, is this better?
Yes, now it's perfect. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, globalization, as I said, is changing in nature, and the trend towards self-reliance and localization is something we will have to take into account when we look at our partnership. Shorter supply chain, global supply chain, is also an opportunity, most likely for Africa. So we have to adopt our approach on how we engage in this context of localized globalization. It's also a context where, let's say, alliances are becoming increasingly asymmetric. On governance, as we all know, EU and US are positioned versus China, which is seen as a systemic rival on governance. But on the welfare state, maybe US is far apart from how the European Union and China are caring for their population. So it is, and we will have to adapt and see how all these dimensions can influence the EU-Africa partnership in this context. Secondly, at national level, what we see emerging on how African states are reacting, it's clear that COVID-19 is a enormous policy challenge, as it is for European countries, and also a major accountability test. And I think Jakkie mentioned it. We see there a rather positive trend coming out that most of the African countries are reacting in a way that is adequate. There's some countries that where politics and ideological elements prevail, but overall we see a positive trend between those countries that react adequately and the levels of influence on the evolution of the viral curve. So accountability may come out, and inclusive approaches may come out strengthened out of this crisis, which of course is a very important point. Another element is indeed, and I think Dr. Workneh mentioned it as well, the multilateral approaches. We have seen the African Union reacting swiftly setting up of this the team of envoys, having a continental approach with the African Center for Disease Control. So there's some positive elements. And maybe a last point, what we noted is a rejection of Afro-pessimism. We heard quite some voices calling for more trust in the Africa's capacity to adapt. All this not to minimize, of course, the impact and the curse. Economic impact might well be much worse than the disease. But as you know, in March, 1 week before the lockdown ended in Europe, we have proposed our proposals for a strengthened partnership with the African continent. And we think they still stand. Of course, the emergency is now to help African countries. That's what we have done with the Team Europe package, 20 billion euros. It's not all new money, but it is resources to help African countries to react, to create a fiscal space, but also to offer the financial resources for them to mobilize the health reaction, but also to cushion the immediate economic impact of the crisis. And that will remain very important. But the whole proposals we have made on green transition, digital transformation, growth and jobs, also in peace and security, migration and mobility, reflecting our real interest, but where we want to build this joint interest, we probably will have to see them much more from the angle of recovery. How can indeed the continental free trade area now be mobilized more swiftly to contribute to the recovery of the continent? The green transition will be certainly extremely important. The health crisis we are facing now is also a result of how we deal with the global goods we have in this world. So green transition is important. Digital transformation, it has been said, it's an accelerator of growth. So I think we have a good basis now. We have to look at those priorities now from the crisis angle, but I think there's also an opportunity to look much more strategically. I think when so much is at stake, I think on both sides, we value even more the notion and the need to work together and to find common solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, KOEN, for providing the European Union perspective. And actually, I was looking at the questions that were asked through the chat. And now the challenging part comes, because they are all excellent. And I have the tough role to actually choose which one we should ask our panelists. I did sort of a mix of some of the most interesting ones and most relevant ones for the points that have been raised so far. And I think there is a great interest from our audience in answering the following points. First of all is the type of assistance that the European Union, or Europe in general, and the United States can provide for the security sector in Africa in the future. Is the current framework that we use to assist adequate, or will it have to change to adapt to new circumstances? Think, for instance, about security sector reform. A second question has to do with the economic dimensions. Will there be a geopolitics of debt and more struggle to ensure economic influence in the continent? And what's here the role of the European Union in act as a possibly honest broker in that respect, cooperating with African countries? And the third question has to do with the sources of fragility and violence. And if we look, for instance, at violent extremism, a question was asked whether do we expect violent extremist movements such as Al-Shabaab, for instance, to take a more responsible approach toward COVID-19 to their own advantage, of course, and how to tackle that. And also, if we think about protests and riots, do we think that non-peaceful movements will in a way increase, or will the most violent type of protests take place as a result of the situation that we are seeing right now? What I suggest is that speakers who would like to answer those questions make a sign to me to take the floor. please limit your answer to one of these questions, and if you could just limit to a couple of minutes speech, because we are 10 minutes ahead of the end of the session. So who would like to go first? I see Dr. Workneh, who would like to take the floor. You have the floor now.
Thank you very much. Just to react upon the point that you raised about the assistance of European Union and others for the region. I want to recognize the fast track assistance from European Union, as well as Sweden as a country who came to the Horn to assist this COVID, which we are working very closely. For me, this time is a time of solidarity. The people are watching, the world is watching, and most of the countries are inward looking. At this very important time, reaching out and assisting other countries like Africa, especially in the Horn, is a very important one. The security sector reform issue is a very important issue, but for me, the most important thing is addressing the issue from the grassroots. That is the young population who are still, they are fighting for democracy. They are open-minded. They are going to be the owner of this continent tomorrow, this region, but they are not part of this, the economy. And they are very vulnerable for any kind of problem that may. So because of this, the most important question, more than security, is how to address the youth. The new generation is a very important one. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Workneh. And indeed, a crucial point about the youth. And we also had a question on that. So you answered without even being posed the question, which is great. Thanks a lot. Anybody else who want to take the floor? I see Judd. Judd has raised his hand. So Judd Devermont, go ahead.
Thank you, Giovanni. I just want to respond to the question from Comfort about whether some of the extremist groups will start to respond to COVID-19 proactively. And I think that is certainly a probable case for some of them. Al-Shabaab, as you mentioned in your notes, has already set up a committee that corresponds with how they responded to the famine, or at least the second round of the famine, not the 2011, but the later shorter famine in the 2016, 2017 period. I would think that ISIS West Africa in the Lake Chad Basin would also do that, given how focused they are on hearts and minds and the fact there has been an outbreak in Borno State. I would not think that Boko Haram, the Shekau faction, would. So I think you have to look at sort of how big is the outbreak in areas that they operate or in communities that they access, and then how does that extremist group think about its relationship with the community? I'll stop there.
Thank you, Judd. Anybody else who would like to take some of the few minutes left to provide answers to the questions? I'm trying to see, I see KOEN wanted to, yes, KOEN.
Experts, but I'm still willing to chip in, because I forgot indeed to mention the debt issue, which beyond the emergency support we have mobilized, there's a clear interest for the European Union and its member states to bring forward the issue of debt, because this is something that we consider that will be necessary, and it's probably the major systemic response that can be provided for the huge economic impact that and budgetary macroeconomic impact that most African countries will face. But there was a question whether we have to change our response to economic support to Africa. And I think we remain convinced, but of course we will have to discuss this with our African partners, is that the emphasis on investment, on job creation, on skill development, that remains valid. And that, of course, the big positive news on the African side is this African Continental Free Trade Area, which means that there is much more resolve on the African side to work towards a better investment climate, a business climate, conditions for growth. And this is a major opportunity where we will want to link into. Thank you.
Thank you, KOEN. We have time for just one last speaker who would like to react. So if there is anyone, I see Jakkie had unmuted himself, so probably you would like to say some words, if I interpret this correctly.
Yes, thanks, Giovanni. I just wanted to make the point that there's no doubt that in the short term, the impact of COVID in Africa can be quite destabilizing. We are going to see an increase in violent protest, food riots, and so on. We've already seen some of that in Africa. But as we're also saying in the chat function, I think the impact eventually will be to improve accountability. So democracies will become, in a sense, more accountable. But I think it also provides the opportunity for authoritarian governments to use that opportunity to subvert democracy and to move the other way. But I think generally it's important to recognize that different to the situation elsewhere in the world, democracy is on the rise in Africa, and it will continue to grow and to increase in depth and in quality. Ordinary Africans have had enough of authoritarian leadership, and that provides, I think, a great hope for the future.
Thank you, Jakkie. So we are 3 minutes to the end of the session. I would like, before wrapping up, to possibly just give Irina, as one of the representatives of the co-organizers of this forum, to just give us a goodbye or just a final remark. And I take this opportunity to thank your minister for organizing this forum. So if you would like to just say some concluding words.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure about concluding words, but I would say it was very, very interesting to listen to all the interventions during this hour. It went very fast. And I think I could subscribe to everything that has been said. And I'm happy that Jakkie got the final, I would call it the final intervention then with that positive note, because I do see that a lot of the discussions that we have in the European Union, I'm sure that KOEN would agree with me, is really, to look more at what is it then that Europe can offer. And we feel, I think, that the youth in Africa are actually looking more towards European solutions and the way that we have solved our societies and how we have built peaceful societies and sustainability in our countries, many of our countries at least, rather than looking in other directions, I would say. So I also have a great hope to the youth, and I think we need to do everything we can to continue giving hope to the youth that we will show that solidarity that someone else was mentioning and be there together. This is really something we need to overcome together, and I think the links between the EU and Africa are strong, and they can only be stronger. So that, I think, will be my final remark. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Irina, for reinforcing this message. It's very, very important, especially in the current context. And perhaps to conclude this panel, transformation in the international system is no big news. We just have to accept that under the present circumstances, we may have to deal with a bit more uncertainty due to the pandemic shock than usual, and that this creates an important variable in our plans and strategies to achieve sustainable peace and development in Africa. But I think that pretty much like our health systems and have the tools to learn how to treat and hopefully prevent the spread of the virus, we have to trust the power of science in that respect. We also possess the analytical instruments and methodologies and data that can help us navigate through uncertainty and adapt to tackle the changing dynamics of conflicts. So here we really have to master as much as possible the power of knowledge and the trust in knowledge and the foresight that we can use to shape a better world, and also to reinforce the institutional mechanisms that we have. And here there are several experts around the table that know very much how a good foresight can be important in order to get to desirable scenarios for the future and shape international cooperation in that respect. So I would like to thank, on behalf of the UISS, all our panelists and speakers and participants. Again, I'm sorry that it wasn't possible to get all the questions from the audience. Most of them were really great. So perhaps there will be other sessions in the future that we will manage to organize, perhaps in person. And thanks a lot for your participation, and wish you a good continuation of the forum and a nice week ahead. And most importantly, stay safe. Bye-bye.